providing financial straight talk for those working and enjoying life after work. This is America's Financial Headquarters.
Yeah, and Mike, I think it's important for everybody to, in understanding this analogy. Unfortunately, the way that the financial industry has approached things with consumers, they've kind of basically encouraged consumers to think about retirement as a number. And there's even been some television commercials where people are toting around
what's
a
your
number.
Yeah.
And the what that ultimately signifies is that's kind of the number that they're saying, oh, if you reach this number, this is the peak of the mountain. You've ultimately climbed everything and you're there.
Signifies the end of the ascent, or in our case, the end of the accumulation phase.
That's exactly right. But the fact of the matter is that the big challenge is the descent.
Right.
And that's why we wanted to kind of create this analogy with the Mount Everest story. For those of you that aren't aware, Mount Everest, has an elevation of 29,000 feet. It was first climbed by Sir Edmund Hillary on May 29th of 1953. The first American to do it was James Whittaker about 10 years later. Now, what most of us don't know about this is that there are actually still 120 dead bodies remaining on Mount Everest.
Literally frozen in the ice on Mount Everest.
In 1996 alone, and there was a book published about this, there were 98 people who attempted the trek. They wanted to reach the peak. 12 of them died that exact same year. That's in a ratio of approximately 8-1. And the book, it's titled Dark Summit, and basically it chronicles the tragedies on Mount Everest in 2006 when 11 climbers had perished on the mountain. But the really startling statistic that's revealed in this book is that 80% of all the fatalities occurring on Mount Everest during the last 50 years have happened on the descent. On the way up, the mountain, these climbers are motivated by some of the spectacular views that they're seeing. They're so excited to get to the top of the mountain. There's all this this enthusiasm that they're carrying. However, on the descent, they now have gravity pulling them toward these horrifying views of 10,000-foot drop-offs and into the abyss. And many don't wisely conserve oxygen, which is their most precious commodity, and they lose the energy and the willpower to continue to make the descent. And I think that that's very similar to what happens with retirement planning.
Yeah, I think what happens is people falsely identify the finish line.
That's right.
They think the finish line is getting to the top of Mount Everest, and the reality is, the most difficult part still lies ahead, and that's getting yourself back down successfully and alive. And the same thing happens with your financial planning. So many people think that the finish line, as you pointed out a few moments ago, is hitting that number.
Right.
What is that accumulation point at which I think I'm finally going to be comfortable and satisfied? The reality is that's when the real work just starts.
Right. That's exactly it. And, the thing is that a lot of folks wrestle with, how do I approach retirement income planning and how should I look at this? And, what you really need to do is look at retirement income and look at your income sources almost as a three-legged stool. And some of you may have heard this analogy before, but if you look at the three-legged stool, there's basically one leg is made up of Social Security. One leg is made up of corporate or government defined benefit pension plans. And the third leg is ultimately your personal savings and your retirement accounts that you've created.
And the defined benefit pension plans have been reducing dramatically over the years. So
that's right.
The difference between defined benefit plan and defined contribution plan is who has the onus. So in other words, in the old days, it was often that a company would provide a defined benefit plan which basically guaranteed income for the participants. But today, it's more of a defined contribution world that we live in. So, for example, the popular 401k plans, that's a defined contribution. You are putting money in. Your employer may or may not be matching. You are putting money in, but that money is just going towards a number. It doesn't guarantee the income. It doesn't guarantee the descent or the distribution, as we've been talking.
You're listening to America's Financial Headquarters Radio, and we have been discussing a little bit about retirement income planning and how to kind of mentally visualize, your retirement income plan. And Mike, you touched on a moment ago the number, and we've been discussing, that's not really the finish line. That's almost the start of it. There's another number that I think is important. When we were discussing this three-legged stool, an important thing to look at is the Social Security leg. And unfortunately, most people don't look at that as a number, or they look at it the wrong way as a number. What I mean by that is when you receive your Social Security statement, you may look at, if you haven't retired, you may look at what your monthly benefit's going to be. And let's just say for a husband and a wife, let's just say that between the two of them, that monthly benefit is $3,500, or let's look at $3,500 between a husband and a wife. If you annualize that, that's something to the tune of $40,000 a year. Now, the way that you need to look at Social Security is you need to look at that $40,000 a year as a much bigger number than $40,000 even. You have to look at, what would it take for me to generate $40,000 a year? And that might be $1 million.
How big would the asset need to be to throw off that amount of income each year?
That's where we start, and where our Financial HQ Network advisors will start in the planning process. We're going to start at the Social Security leg to maximize this asset, which is exactly the reason why we have all of these events scattered all throughout the nation.
Very complex decision that you have to make. There's tons of different variables that come into making a decision about when and how to take your Social Security income.
And if you're interested, go to financialhq.com. We can certainly help you with that. There's a number of events that are on there. Just click on the events tab. There are events that basically we're discussing strategies to maximize your benefits. Ultimately, how do you take that $1 million now that you've taken it from a monthly number into a much bigger number, and you're looking at that leg of your income a little bit differently? How is it that you're going to get the most out of that, and what strategies should you consider to employ there? But let's now jump into, we've talked about how the defined benefit plan is kind of going away. Let's talk a little bit about the leg that is your personal income, and how is it that a consumer should look at approaching their income planning.
So basically what you want to do is, if you've made your decision about Social Security and now you've got that income coming in, as you pointed out, Mark, we want to almost reference that as though how big would the asset need to be to throw off that amount of income each year. And now we're going to look at our own personal savings and figure out what additional income do we need in order to start backing into how are we going to create a distribution model? How are we going to create a distribution plan for those assets to start taking whatever the desired amount of income is off of that, but then continue to protect and just essentially manage the rest of those assets that aren't yet to the distribution point.
You're exactly right. Income planning is a tricky thing, and what most consumers will want to do, and we're certainly not going to be able to get into every little detail from a planning perspective, but what most consumers will want to do is look at what their hard costs are, in terms of what's their rent, what's their house payment, what are their utilities, what are the concrete costs that we know are going to be there day in and day out, and look at guaranteeing an income stream to cover that element. The additional expenses that may come in, now we can perhaps take a little bit more risk to cover some of those expenses, because maybe those aren't always, necessities.
What throws a lot of people a curveball, Mark, is that most financial advisors are trained on the accumulation phase.
Right.
They're not trained and educated on the distribution phase. And quite honestly, the distribution phase is usually the most important phase, and that's why we spend so much time with the Financial HQ Network advisors talking and providing training opportunities for them on the distribution phase.
That's exactly right.